So thank you everyone for coming tonight, and thank you to the panel. We have Martin Powell-Davies from the NEU, we have Maryam Asaria, who's one of our local CLP members and a teacher and also in the NEU. We have Jumbo Chan, who, whilst also being a teacher in the NEU, is a Labour councillor in Kensal Green. And over here we have David Pinto-Duschinsky, who is the prospective parliamentary candidate for Hendon as well. Oh, oh, no. The pen has come down.
School Cuts over. Job's done.
Do we have something heavy?
Stick that.
Yeah.
Oh, you've got some tape?
Yeah, all the way from Moscow.
Oh, wow.
Perfect.
Just in his pocket.
Thank you very much. So the running order tonight, we've got a talk from each of the panel members, and I'll introduce those in a moment. And then we'll open up to a Q&A. So any questions you have about any of the talks or any local issues you'd like to raise, we'll go through those. And finally, we'll have an open discussion with anyone in the audience and the panel about the potential of a national education service. The aim of tonight is not just to provide you with information, but also to give you opportunities on how to get involved, contribute or support pupils and educators fighting the cuts and also getting involved in forming Labour policy as well. So first up we have Martin, and Martin is going to be talking about how we got to where we are today with the education system, the cuts and the problems of testing as well.
Thank you. Well, thanks everyone for coming along to the discussion tonight, and I'm sure there will be quite a wide-ranging debate. The first thing to notice is that the font size of the younger teacher beside me is somewhat smaller, so I'm putting my glasses on to be able to read what I've got on much larger font. But colleagues and comrades, I mean, education has always been an absolutely key question for the Labour movement, and rightly so. You know, if you go back to the pioneers of our movement, right back to the self-educated Chartists, to the founders of mass trade unionism, to the first victorious Labour candidates who were fighting for seats on the school boards, particularly in London, go back to Karl Marx and the other socialist theoreticians, then the struggle to win genuine education for the working class has always been an absolutely key part of our wider struggle for a better future, for a socialist future. And why? Because after all, the struggle for better paying conditions, for better housing and health, all of those things I don't think are ends in themselves. What we are trying to do is to provide an environment in which the human personality can genuinely flourish, where the skills and talents of all individuals can be developed to their maximum for the benefit of society as a whole. To coin a phrase, for the many, not the few. And the National Education Union, I'm now the London Regional Secretary of the NEU. We were formed from the merger of the NEU and ATL unions, if people aren't aware of that. We're not affiliated to any political party, but we're very proud to say that the NEU stands in those traditions of struggling for a better future and for a high-quality, comprehensive education system for all. Now, we're a union now of over 450,000 members. So the NEU does have the potential strength to influence the debates needed around education, but also to organise to make the changes necessary. And I'm also very proud to say, as London Regional Secretary, that in London our density is greatest of all. We've got 75,000 NEU members in London, largely teachers, but also support staff. And actually, whether you know it, Barnet, with over 3,300 in-service members, is now our largest London district of all. Although, as Keith, I'm sure, will tell you, that brings both its complications and its strengths. But, you know, as the NEU, you know, we absolutely welcome Labour's commitment to develop a national education service, which, alongside policies which will also be needed to eradicate poverty and inequality, has the potential to transform education and the lives of children and young people. But I think, as the Chair said, we need to go back and have a little think about how we got here. Because we've got to recognise that those kind of policies will only be won and only be implemented through a struggle against those who frankly do not share our common values, who stand not for equality, but for inequality and for austerity. And we need to think about how the consensus, which was in favour of a well-funded comprehensive education system in the interests of a society as a whole, was broken at the end of the post-war boom. And so you had a time when Margaret Thatcher, I mentioned her, was Education Secretary. Actually, Margaret Thatcher presided over more grammar schools becoming comprehensive schools than any other Education Secretary. Because at that time, that was where the consensus was, that actually education was needed for a developing economy. But then, of course, we headed to stormier times, where education for all was a luxury that perhaps could no longer be afforded. And therefore, the gains that we'd won, as ever, far from perfectly implemented, were then wrecked by the imposition of a neoliberal education policy implemented in Britain and internationally, not just in Britain, with really the aims of, first of all, cutting the costs of education by making schools compete in an education marketplace to drive down the costs according to market theories, and at the same time opening up education as another source of income for private companies and academy trusts. Now, the politicians first created that marketplace by making sure that all schools could be compared, if you like goods in a supermarket, by a prescribed national curriculum so that everybody could be compared on the same basis, and then, of course, the standardised test, the SATs, to compare school and teacher performance. And, of course, it had the particular advantage for politicians that instead of blaming governments, putting the blame where it normally lies, for governments failing to address poverty, for failing to fund education, you could use those results to instead point the finger and put the blame on individual schools, on individual school managements, on individual staff, and of course their trade unions. They're saying the fault was that it's your fault that you're not performing up to scratch. And then of course on top of that you bring in the Ofsted inspection system, created so that you could then label those schools as failures and in turn make sure that they were turned over into the hands of academy trusts. That's the system that was created. And I have to say, for a while, that ideological attack, and I've got to say there was to some extent a new consensus, and I think we have to agree that included some new Labour politicians as well as Conservative politicians, that was the new consensus, and it did have an effect. Education spending has been cut. Locally accountable community schooling has been dismantled in many areas. SATs and Ofsted have forced up the stress and workload and staff and students alike. So just to say something about the cuts, and I don't want to steal the thunder of others who will follow me, but you'll know from the figures in front of me here how much has been cut in Barnet, according to the National Education Union. But I have to say it's not just the National Education Union that understands that reality. In fact, there was a report that just came out today from the Institute for Fiscal Studies. It was analysing the various Conservative contenders' claims about extra spending for schools. I mean, the fact that the Tory contenders have to mention spending for schools, I think, is significant. It shows that they are under some pressure. But that IFS report confirmed that through all the hyperbole, that the government spending plans that exist now actually, at the moment, are forecasting further cuts, not increased expenditure on education. So things, despite all the promises, are not getting better, they're getting worse. Buildings maintenance, staff training, learning resources have been cut across the sector. And all of that's bad enough. But of course, the vast majority of a school budget is spent on staff. So what has actually happened is that school cuts have meant cutting teaching assistants and other support staff, not replacing teachers as they leave, so larger class sizes, needs left unmet, even higher workload for those staff left behind. And again, just to stress that, let's take some of the government's own statistics, their latest workforce statistics. they showed that English schools had 137,000 more pupils, but 5,400 fewer teachers to support them, and similar reductions in support staff numbers too. So clearly things are getting worse, and there are particular areas of education that take even sharper attacks. So nursery schools, post-16 special needs, there's a lot that could be said on those areas. As I say, other speakers will mention it, and there's a rally on Saturday that I know will get a mention later, where you can find out a lot more. But to come from that position to now, I think the important thing and the thing that we should be positive about is that parents and voters are now beginning to see through that spin and realise what's at stake over the cuts. And I think the same is also true over high-stakes testing, like the SATS test at 7-11 and the various other tests, baseline, phonics and multiplication tests that are all used not really to compare pupils, but, as I said before, fundamentally to compare schools and staff. And I think more and more staff and more parents and carers are beginning to realise that those tests are absolutely nothing to do with improving education. They are unreliable and they're unnecessary. Does a SATS mark give a parent any of the real information they want to know about their child? No, they don't. Of course, teachers and schools have always relied on assessment to inform their work, and they'll continue to do so. But, you know, these high-stakes tests are not about informing, they're about labelling children, not helping them, and that we have to make sure that parents understand. You've got to link it back to that context. They were brought in not to support education, but to support the marketisation of education, where you put pressure on staff, therefore to teach to the test, to get their results up, narrowing the curriculum, and in turn putting very unfair pressures on young children. All because that those staff and schools and their managements are being put under the pressure of the threat of failure, personal failure, from the threat of capability proceedings, of rejected pay progression, and of course institutional failure through Ofsted grading and then your position in the league tables and so on. But again, I think the tide is turning on that. The fact that Jeremy Corbyn announced to the NEU conference in April that an incoming Labour government would scrap SATs is a very welcome testament to that change. But again, just to conclude, as with cuts, then I think an appeal to reason, although you would hope that that would affect, will absolutely have no effect whatsoever on the mind of a Tory government and those who lead it. I mean, why would they be electing any of their leadership candidates if good sense was anything to do with it? Clearly it's not. But therefore, we have to take steps to back up our arguments which are absolutely clear to make sure that they are actually put into practice. And that's why right at the moment we're halfway through an indicative ballot that the National Education Union is conducting of all our primary members, asking members whether they would be prepared to take action to boycott high-stakes testing next year. Now, the ballot ends on July the 2nd, and so one of perhaps the concrete things that could come out of this meeting is that any help you can give in supporting Barnet NEU, in contacting its primary members, would be a very useful thing and very immediate thing to come out of the meeting tonight. But, you know, I'm sure there's plenty more I could say, but there are other speakers to come, and the only thing I'd like to say, in conclusion, that unfortunately we've had now decades of a market-driven education policy, and at the centre of those is those twin attacks of, on the one hand, the spending cuts, and on the other hand, the high-stakes testing. And those two policies, along with others, have damaged the well-being and life chances of too many young people. So together we need to stop those attacks, and we need to win a government that will look after the interests of the billions, not the billionaires, and not least the interests of our young people. And together let's construct the education of the future that the Labour movement has long fought for.
Thanks everyone for coming tonight. Education is a really important issue, and Martin has outlined a lot of the kind of big picture of where public education is at the moment. And then what I would like to do with my speech is just to flesh out some of what is actually happening, and perhaps more importantly, where we can go on from here. So I'd just like to say, Simon mentioned it already, that it's quite important to mention that I am a councillor, I'm a teacher. So I see cuts to both schools and local government. I'm at the, and I'm sorry to use this phrase, I hate it, but I'm at the front line, at the forefront of the attack on public services. So I see quite vividly what's happening. But I think when we think about these massive cuts and, you know, neoliberalisation, market-driven education, high-stake testing, etc., we really need to think about it from the point of view of the child, the person who's at the centre of all this. And I wrote an article recently called, for the Tribune, called "The Children of Austerity," and before I wrote that, actually, I asked some students, I asked some young people I know in my capacity as councillor, do you feel like, do you feel there's austerity around? And then actually, and this surprised me, they said no. They said no. And that's because, and then I just thought about it, I thought why? And like any other good teacher, you'd know actually, people with very limited life experience only know what's there. So they've grown up since 2010 under austerity. So what we see as cuts actually is normality for them. And I think that's really, really important to consider before we move on. So what is normal for them? If I were to give, the big stats, it would be 8% cuts to each pupil in England. But what does that mean from the student's point of view? It means big class sizes, it means lack of resources, which we might have taken for granted when we were younger. It means very few extracurricular activities, and it means actually for subjects like art and music and drama, these subjects, and in fact actually I might add Latin, to dedicate to one of the leaders of the Tory party or the future leader. These kind of subjects will in the future be the privy, the exclusive things that only the wealthy will have, and I think that is a disgrace. But compounded by the kind of school cuts is also, I think, worth mentioning the teaching and the teaching crisis, the recruitment and retention crisis, where, it's a really famous stat, but for every teacher who goes into teaching, up to half of them leave before 5 years. So actually, I know colleagues who've been excellent teachers who've left after 3-4 years. I've only been a teacher myself for 5 years, approaching 5 years, and a lot of teachers, because of the school cuts and actually other pressures such as Martin alluded to, SATs, paperwork, etc. They're actually feeling burnt out. And from the child's point of view, what this means is, and I think it's a great shame, so whereas we might think of our own school experience as having, Mr. Smith or Mr. Clough or Miss Meckin or whatever, teachers who've been there for decades and, really experienced teachers, what students experience actually is teachers who, they might have English, where it's been taught by 2 or 3 even teachers in one single year. Think about the teaching experience they're getting and compare that actually, contrast that with maybe what they might get in private schools, but we're not going to talk about that tonight. All of this is kind of subsumes under a wider, as Martin said, a wider neoliberal framework. And I think academisations, academies and free schools represent that most clearly. And I think actually if we go down this route where there's lack of resources, where there's teacher burnout, where schools are going to be competing with each other, actually the logical outcome of that will be students, far from actually being just children of austerity, they'll become what Thatcher would have wanted, which is the ideal free market citizen, the kind of person who, because there's lack of resources, they need to look out for one person only, and that's themselves. So I'm always reminded of Thatcher's phrase that, you know, what her goal really is, economics is the means, but her goal is to change the heart and soul of the nation. And I think with education we have a very clear example of that happening. From a councillor's point of view, and I think this is incredibly sad, and I think we should talk about this later, but I'm going to highlight it now. Are the cuts to after-school services, the cuts to youth clubs, the cuts to libraries. These are actually crucial educational resources, but they're not seen as that. They're just seen as frivolous extras, and I find that quite bewildering in a way. So we've had 600 youth clubs being closed, 500 libraries being closed since 2010. And all of that really, the child, they go to school, there's, you know, bits, schools like falling apart, teachers are leaving, they're not getting the subjects they want, there's oversized classes, and at the same time, when they leave school, they don't have the libraries or the youth centres to go to. So when we think about knife crime, when we think about mental health, and I think it's ironic that, you know, Theresa May said that it should be the job of teachers to look after the mental health of students, as it should be. But, you know, what about the governments? Where are they? What about you, Prime Minister? But if we think about that, actually, what's happening really is, I think, quite. And I mean this, a degradation of, you know, childhood itself, because children, as we know, is a truism. They only have one chance, one experience of growing up, and then this is what the current generation is going through. I think also with all of this, it changes the substance of education, and it becomes really, as Martin kind of alluded to earlier, education not for humanizing, not for enriching, not for growing, not for nurturing the human soul, but actually education now where you just have to fight for scraps, and then hopefully the winner will be able to get a foot into the marketplace, and then the losers, as it were, they can do whatever else. And that's why, actually, I think last Saturday's announcement, where Jeremy said we're going to talk about now social justice rather than social mobility, that's actually really important, and I hope we talk about that later. But it's not all bad news. Within all of this, there is a lot of it's patently clear that this is not sustainable, and there is a lot of pushback and a lot of fight back. And I'd just like to talk about two campaigns. The first campaign is the School Cuts campaign. I'm a part of the NEU Councillors Network, and we've helped out with that. 2 months ago, we got over 1,000 signatures from councillors all around the UK, from across the different parties, including the Conservative Party. And then with those 1,000 signatures, we went straight to the heart of the problem, the Department for Education, and we delivered the letter, the petition, to say actually enough is enough. Unsurprisingly, the minister didn't come down, but I think what's really happening is an information war, because even Tory councillors and Tory councils know that there are these school cuts. They are very real, they are happening, but the departments of education, the governments, they're trying to hide as best as they can. And why not, you know? Of course you would be ashamed of it. So there is an information war happening. But one silver lining, as it were, is because of this, Kevin Courtney mentioned this a few months ago, but in 2017, actually, what was seen as quite a provincial issue, the idea of school cuts education, was actually at the forefront of the 2017 general election campaign. And if there is going to be a general election soon, which hopefully there will, this is something which the Conservatives will do very much to hide. I should also mention, though, that this information war between us and the government is also worth pointing out that it's not just a government which I think needs to be better informed, but in fact some of the Labour Party, segments of the Labour Party, where I think for too long there's been placid, implicit acceptance of the government's academisation programme, that there is no alternative. I think that this is an issue where we need to be on the very front line, and I hope actually with the National Education Service, it's still a very nebulous concept. And I think really our job as campaigners, as activists, as parents, teachers, councillors, governors, etc., really is to contribute to this really exciting notion, and to not only kind of reverse the bad stuff, as Martin has mentioned, of the last 20, 30 years, but actually completely overhaul and create a new radical vision of what education can be. I hope we discuss that later, but that's it for me. Thanks very much.
So I wanted to talk a bit about equality in education, so take a different stance and stuff. But everything's enhanced by the problems of marketisation in education and the whole neoliberal climate. So I wanted to talk about two groups in particular, and those were students from ethnic minorities and students with special educational needs and disability. So starting with students from ethnic minority backgrounds. So many years of data has actually shown that the majority of students from minority backgrounds constantly underperform in national exams in comparison to the majority of white students in England. And so, you know, why is that? And so when we look into our education system, we see that usually students from ethnic minorities are placed in lower sets, and data shows that if you're placed in lower sets, you're less likely to achieve. Further, pupils from ethnic minorities are routinely punished more harshly, they're praised less, they're told off more often, and actually are 1.5 times more likely than white students to be identified as having behaviour-related or special educational needs. And actually, recently, a paper was published by David Gilbourne, a professor in race and education in Birmingham University, and he found that students of Black Caribbean background are 3 times more likely to be permanently excluded, and in some schools actually 4 times more likely as well to be permanently excluded than their white British peers. And this is actually an even bigger problem when we get to later years, so in years 9, 10 and 11 when students begin to take their GCSEs, and I'll talk about why that might be the case a bit later on. So, detailed qualitative research has revealed a persistent problem of stereotyping and unconscious bias in the treatment of black students. And sometimes, despite their best efforts, research constantly demonstrates that teachers tend to have much lower academic expectations for black students and to be wary of them as potential sources of disciplinary problems. So how can we solve this? Well, schools, in 1999, a grant was introduced to schools, and it was called the Ethnic Minority Achievement Grant. It was essentially provided according to the number of children from underachieving ethnic minority groups. However, this was slashed in 2011, and it no longer exists, and essentially there's no longer a pot of money for schools to really try and get rid of this, this divide. Further, it used to be mandatory for schools to take proactive steps to tackle racial discrimination and promote equality of opportunity and good race relations. This is no longer mandatory, rather everything comes in the basis of equalities, and so no school is really pushed to deal with race in particular. And so school, I spoke about school exclusions. In between around 1998 to 2001, actually the number of school exclusions for black students in particular dropped significantly, and that's because the government at the time had put a drive in schools to really make sure that they were trying to reduce the number of exclusions, and it evidently helped. In 2001, this was taken away because they said, okay, we've pretty much sorted the issue. And now what we see is that school exclusions, again for black students, are increasing. And this is obviously a problem. And so there's not as much data at the minute on how academies are kind of dealing with this problem, but actually it's found that academies' exclusion rates are much higher. And particularly in the early days of academisation, academies permanently exclude pupils at roughly twice the rate of LA-maintained secondary schools. And black pupils are generally the most likely to be excluded from academies, and the Black Caribbean rate is 3.6 times more than that for white students in LA-maintained secondary schools. Then another group that I wanted to talk about was special educational needs and disabilities. And it's already sort of been mentioned, so school cuts have been affecting particular groups, and the group of special educational needs and disability children are really affected. In particular, the NEU has recently revealed that £1.2 billion have been cut since 2015 to the SEN budget. And that's around a 17% cut. So what's happening is not only has money been cut in real terms, but actually the demand for SEN funding has also increased. And so the increase in money has not actually taken account for this. And then also, as Martin said, a lot of money has been taken away from the staffing budget, and so TAs are lost. And what that tends to do is actually affect students from particular groups like special educational needs a lot more, because these are students that tend to need the one-to-one help from a TA but are no longer getting it. So this has led to the problem of off-rolling, which you might have heard of recently in the news. And this is the idea that schools are getting rid of students who could do badly in exams in an effort to boost their position in league tables. So as we said, there's competition between schools, right? Schools need to do really well so that they get a good standing in their league table, so that they attract as many students as they possibly can. And it's actually found that the number of students signed up to a school in year 10 is a lot lower for particular schools than the number of students found in year 11. And again, the problem seems to be a lot worse in academies. And it was found that on average, the number of year 10 to year 11, the number of students decreasing was actually 2% from 2017 to 2018, which in comparison to 0.1% in, which was 7 years ago. So we're losing a lot more students at the minute. Now, of the 50 biggest academy chains, the 4 that lost the most students, so as I said, academies were the worst culprits of this, was a Delta Academies Trust, which is a trust in West Yorkshire. Another was the Aldridge Education Trust, but closer to home in London was the Harris Education Trust, which some of you may have heard of, so from Harris Schools, which actually lost 166 pupils. So 166 pupils just disappeared from year 10 to year 11. And a lot of them are actually unaccounted for. Okay, so not really sure where they went. Some people say that, increase in homeschooling, etc. But a lot of these children were from particular target groups, so children eligible for free school meals, which is often kind of signed for working class students, children from children that are looked after, children from minority ethnic groups, and children with special educational needs and disabilities. So it's thought that a lot of these students are going to alternative provisions. So, for example, PRUs, so pupil referral units, which is a place that you go if you're excluded from mainstream school, or special schools in particular. Now, the problem with this is that outcomes for all groups of pupils who leave the role of mainstream school are really poor. And they only have around 1% of children who leave from state alternative to special schools are achieving 5 good GCSEs. So chances are significantly reduced for students when they are sent to alternative provisions. Now I just wanted to end with an email that was sent to a head teacher from a special needs coordinator at a secondary school in South England, and it said, "I had a meeting today with some Year 6 parents. They have a child with complex needs. He receives high needs funding and is currently at primary A. They were keen to tell me about how secondary B told them that they would not be able to support their child. He would be isolated, working in one room. They would not be able to protect him from 6-foot students, and he couldn't do GCSEs, so he would leave with nothing." The parents said to him that surely you cannot say no to a child with special educational needs and disabilities, but they were told that as long as secondary C has a place somewhere, they don't actually have to take him. This isn't the first time a parent has told me that they were encouraged to go elsewhere. So the idea is that students from particular groups who schools know will not necessarily achieve and help their league tables are essentially being sent elsewhere, and we're letting them down. So moving forward, if we've got a national education service, I really think we need to look into ways that we can actually stop or reduce the disparity between students from ethnic minorities or just disadvantaged backgrounds, and also when we're training teachers, I think we need to look into ways of going against this kind of institutional bias that currently exists. And I think understanding that it exists is the first step, and then doing something about it is the second step. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon, so much. Well, look, thank you all, and thank you all for being here today. It's not just an interesting conversation, but I think it's a conversation that's coming at a critical time. As we sit here this evening, the Tories have just had the second round of their leadership race. Boris Johnson, once again, has surged ahead. We are going to have a new Prime Minister within a month. It will almost certainly be Boris Johnson. We may well have a general election. Yes, be afraid, be very afraid. We may quite possibly have a general election this year. And education, as Jumbo and others have mentioned, will play a central role in that. I think it's really striking that in a Tory leadership contest, where the contenders have made £84 billion worth of tax cut pledges, about the only thing they have talked about spending an additional penny on, nowhere near enough, is education. So they know how important it is politically. And so I think this is a very well-timed meeting to talk about education, not just fighting the cuts, but how our approach to education can form a cornerstone of a radical manifesto that propels Labour into government. Now, I'm down to talk about how we can take some of what we've heard and act locally, and that's where I'm going to focus first. But I also want to spend a few minutes talking not just around the cuts and what we do to try to defeat them locally, but also how the NES can be a transformative springboard for some of the broader things we want to see a Labour government change. But starting locally, I mean, we've heard some of the stats. And to put it in some kind of context, so the IFS came out today, as others have mentioned, with some analysis. And in headline terms, what they said was just to get per pupil spending for 5 to 18-year-olds back to where it was in real terms in 2010 would cost 4.5 billion quid. And if we wanted to safeguard it to 2023, it would cost a further 1.1 billion. So over 5.5 billion quid. That's how big the gap is. To put it another way, and I find that you know, because it can be really hard to wrestle with the figures, our spending on education as a proportion of GDP, which is often the way you should think about some of these things, has declined from the highest it's ever been to the lowest level it's been since 1960. Now, think about that for a second. In 1960, what is it? Less than 5% of people went to university. The majority of people didn't leave school at 16, they left school at 14. We've wound back the clock. Oh, and by the way, the population was lower as well. We have wound back the clock through the government's spending cuts to a period where most were not even given the start of an education. And so that's the first thing we've really got to recognise, how far we've gone and how deep the cuts have been. And we've all seen the stories about this, about schools having, you know, we've heard some really powerful testimony already from the panelists, but we've seen the stories of schools closing at half day. I've talked to heads who talk about, you know, some of the things Maryam mentioned around you know, off-rolling, around all these things. And this isn't just something happening elsewhere. This is happening right here, right now, in Barnet. I mean, the poster, you know, at the front gives you the overall figure. But let me give you some of the texture I've picked up from talking to heads, from talking to teachers, from talking to parents, and from talking to union reps. I mean, I've talked to heads who have talked a lot about the SEN cuts, around large layoffs for teaching staff, for teaching assistants. I've talked to union reps who are dealing with best part of, it's not quite a dozen, but heading in that direction, schools where they are facing processes for redundancy. There's one particular institution, of course, I shan't name it, where they're looking at 200 hours of teaching assistant coverage being cut a week. Right? So this isn't happening to other people. This is happening right here, right now. And I think one of the challenges is that, as you know, Jumbo kind of pointed to, people see elements of this. I mean, I'm a parent. I've got an 8-year-old in state primary school, and we recently lost a teaching assistant. But you don't connect it up with the broader picture. And so parents, you know, when you talk to them, they say, well, we've lost a teaching assistant. We now have that class only 2 terms rather than all 3 terms a year. You know, yes, the reception's going to squeeze. But they don't always see how these dots connect. And I think that's part of the challenge we have as campaigners. Not just to take the argument, but to help show the bigger picture. And this is where I kind of translate what we've heard tonight into the local action we are trying to take. So what we as Hendon constituency Labour Party have been doing is running a local schools campaign to actually get on the school gates and tell parents what is happening. Have those conversations to help give them the detail and give them the facts so that they can mobilise. So we've, I'm going to wave this around. We've had this leaflet produced. We've already gone to best part, I forget the number, have gone to or are scheduled to go to over a dozen schools. And we are looking for volunteers, and I'm afraid I'm sorry, this wouldn't be a good campaigning meeting if I didn't come with a campaigning ask for volunteers to help us cover virtually every school in this constituency. And our ambition is over the next 5 weeks we will cover 30 schools. And so that we can try to talk to, or at least give information to, up to 10,000 parents. Now, we think this can make real change. And this isn't just about telling them what's happening. It's about helping them think about how they organise to deal with the next wave. Because one of the striking stats is already the cuts, even being very conservative, very, generous with the figures, are worth over 250 quid per pupil per year in Hendon, worth over 280 quid per pupil per year across Barnet. But there's more in the post. We know this because the council has already scheduled further cuts, which they've held back on following public outcry, but they're still programmed in. So we know more is coming. And what the IFS says is that certainly on national level, by the end of, I think it's 2020, and I may get the stats slightly wrong here, so please excuse me if I slightly garble the numbers, the average state primary will have seen a per pupil cut of almost £380 a head. So we know more is coming. And so there is an urgency around starting to organise, ensuring parents know, and ensuring that they still have power in their hands to do something about what is coming at us. So that is kind of where we are starting. And my one request to you is it is half an hour's time. Turn up at 8 o'clock, turn up at 2:45, you're done within half an hour to 40 minutes. People are incredible, you just give them a kind of leaflet, you don't need to. We also have a petition. If people were willing to volunteer, even once, the people in this room, we could cover all the schools we need to cover. So in terms of the transformative impact you can have coming from this meeting, I think there's something real that we can all do. And so please come and speak to me afterwards if you have any time to do that. We'd be really, really grateful. But so that's the local cuts campaign. But as I said, I think part of what's so exciting about the concept of the NES is that this is about more than just defeating cuts. I think this is also about the capacity for transformation. People have touched on things like MATs, multi-academy trusts and things like that. But for me, there is almost a bigger picture than that as well, which is, for me, absolutely at the heart of a different view of how the economy works. So much of the poverty and inequality we face is rooted fundamentally in the way our system of education and skills works. Britain, almost uniquely among more industrialised countries, has a long tail of low skills. For the bottom 50% of our population, the mantra in British education, despite the various efforts from Labour governments to improve it, which in many ways they did, is still, if at first you don't succeed, you don't succeed. People who don't do well in education rarely get a second chance. We have far higher levels of low skill than other comparable countries. And the other thing we're really weak at is lifelong learning. So we know the way the economy is changing. Skills that were good 10 years ago no longer sustain good living wage jobs. So for instance, think of a computer programmer growing up in the 90s learning a programming language like C. It's now no longer used. They need to retrain or lose their capacity to work. And we do not have a system that supports them in that. And so our system, not just of education, but of broader skills, militates against giving all the access to social justice, giving all the access to good jobs that we need to create a genuinely fair economy and a genuinely fair society. And it's also self-defeating. This is the irony of Tory education policy. Even if you don't care about people, it's still utterly self-defeating because it locks you in a economy of low productivity and low skills. So the Tories have built a low-skill, low-wage economy. Now, if we're going to build a high-skill, high-wage economy that brings strong wages and power over their own lives to all, then a cornerstone of this is schools that give a proper education to all, a system that supports not just those who are going to university, but all, and supports people throughout their life so that they can sustain the skills they need. Now, and governments have tried and they have failed, and I think an NES providing that kind of framework provides a radical opportunity to do just that. So for me, it's about lots of the things that have been mentioned. making sure there's a socially just system of education, but it's also the cornerstone and engine of a socially just economy. And that's why I'm so excited around the prospects that it offers, and really welcome the conversation that will follow. Anyway, thanks.
So, I suppose I can throw this out to the floor now and ask, does anybody have any questions of the panel, or is there anything anyone would like to raise? Let's go from left to right and start with, let's go along.
Well, I'm a local resident, not a parent, but I did go to St Mary's Primary, Church of England, then on to Christ's College. Mrs Thatcher, the local MP there, and Education Secretary, came along. We showed her the sixth form facilities, a broken record player and a broken chair, and her answer was, others have less. I don't think she meant private school. I also recollect that the sole purpose-built comprehensive in Barnet was Graham Park, now abolished under the Tories. The girls' school, Southall, I think may also have been abolished. That's a good school. And Henrietta Barnet, a good state school, and my niece went there. For many years, they encroached on the premises of Hampstead Garden Suburb Institute. Eventually they had to pay mean profits by a court action, but the sole grant of the Tories for leisure education went to Hampstead Garden Suburb Institute for decades. So that's the Tories. The only other thing I would mention is I noticed tonight, I think BAPS, Barnet Alliance of Public Services, is holding a meeting at the same time. I don't know, I'm not blaming anyone in particular, but I would have thought that the trade unions could get organised. And the final thing I would say, I noticed that the National Education Union was one of the unions representing 24% of trade unionists in June 2016, according to the Labour Research Department, that adopted a neutral approach to the EU referendum. 70% apparently were happy to be represented by unions that said Remain, 2% were silent, and 2% said Leave. I happen to be a Lexit, not Brexit, a Lexit supporter, but make of that what you will. I don't know how far the unions consulted their members, and I certainly don't know the splits in the membership opinion, but maybe that's for another occasion. I don't know.
Mayor?
Yeah, my question is addressed to John Bob. You brought up the fact that the average working shelf life of a new teacher is 5 years and under. Now this begs a few questions. One of which is the cost of this, because we put in a huge amount of resource into training teachers. The other, is there an element of being underpaid as one of the reasons we're losing new teachers? And the third is, basically, are we able to train enough teachers to keep this recycling process going? Because 5 years, I think teacher training is what, 3 years? And the teachers lasting 5? 1?
Yeah,
Okay. Well, anyway, can you sort of...
apparently, where a lot of other countries are looking for like a focused form of teacher training, like a National Institute of Education in, say, Singapore, over the last few years in this country, it's actually broken out. There are now 16 different routes to becoming a teacher. Quite a few of them involve being unqualified and being a teacher as well. There are 24,000 unqualified teachers as of last year. I think 24,000. And although the Tories didn't do it at the time, whenever they come up with an idea, we know they're going to come back round with it again. Before Justin Greening quit as Education Secretary, they were proposing introducing a teacher apprenticeship where teachers would be paid £3.50 an hour, £7,000 a year to teach children. So, a disdain for the profession, I think.
Do you want me to answer it now?
Yeah, sure, go for it.
I think I'm a bit of a... in a way, I'm a bit of a... I'm not sure whether you might say... you might call it Marxist, or you might call it actually like a free market economist, like a Thatcherite. But whenever you just think about, you boil down everything, and at bottom, it's about economics and who uses it and who doesn't. And actually, and I think David made this kind of implied his point. He suggested this, which is really that for public education, state education, the Tories don't care about it because they don't use it. That's it. So actually, about the costs to the government. Well, what Simon mentioned, that they do now want other bodies, Teach First, etc., to absorb that cost. But there's also a cost to the teacher. It's £9,000 to do PGCE now. And then, just think of the cost of that. And actually the cost to students. The students who, like I said, might see 1, 2, even 3 different teachers in a single year. The cost to schools. I'm sure there's some middle person making a lot of money with, recruitment, etc., and consultancy, but I haven't got enough data for that. But all I can say is, really, I think the Tories don't care because they're not users of it. Sorry for that economic term. But it just reminds me of... it's a quote by Chomsky. He said something about public services. Really, what you want is if you've got mates in the city, in the private sector, who there's a massive golden opportunity here, with the NHS, with education, etc. But at the moment, it remains untapped. What you do is defund it. You defund public education, and then you run it down, wait until people get angry. Hopefully there's no pushback, there's no information war, as it were. So like David said, the parents who might not, if it wasn't for us campaigning, join the dots between school cuts and what's happening in their schools, but rather just blaming it on lazy teachers, blaming it on poor management, etc. And then Chomsky said, well, in the end, what happens? People get angry with it, then it gets handed over to private power, to private capital, and then it's privatised. And then we're back to, the Victorian times, where education is, as Martin alluded earlier, the reserves of the rich. It's for them, and for everyone else, it's low skill, low wage economy. Off you go, and hopefully by then the robots haven't eaten you, or AI hasn't taken over the world. I think that's what the Tories want, and actually you kind of extrapolate that onto kind of other aspects. Climate disaster, for example, it's not going to be them who's going to be paying the price for their negligence, because they might, at the moment you hear people, they're already, you already hear stories about New Zealand, that's going to be safe from climate disaster, etc. I can imagine in the future, the masses will have a very, very bleak future, but we're here to change that, and hopefully we'll get David into Parliament and get a Labour government which will change that.
Thank you. Sorry, Colleen, I wasn't asked, but I just am struck by one parallel, which is we've seen this in a number of public services, that what the Conservative government has done is cut as much as possible. We've seen massive outflows of people working in those public services, and have kept squeezing and squeezing and squeezing until that surface goes over a cliff. So, for instance, one of the services where this has happened first is prisons, where they cut, and then it reached an inflection point when suddenly disorder in prisons exploded. And then they frantically, having sliced the number of prison officers, frantically went out to try to recruit just enough to head off catastrophe. I think already in parts of the NHS we are seeing exactly the same pattern. They will squeeze it as far as it can go and underinvest, completely coasting on, previous investment by a kind of Labour government. But as they burn through that and erode away, eventually they'll hit bedrock. And my fear is with education, with the stats we've heard tonight, with just the burn through, I don't know where, and one of the problems is they can never judge where that cliff edge is. Right? So are we a year or two off that happening? Are we? No idea. But clearly the stats you've heard are unsustainable, just from a straightforward public policy point of view. You cannot run schools if you're losing half of your teachers every 5 years. It just doesn't work. Anyway.
Jenny?
Teacher recruitment and running down public services, completely agree. I want to ask David where you join the dots between a local funding campaign, which I'm going to be with you at school gates, of course, and the NES.
So thank you. So in a couple of places. Firstly, let's be really clear about this. The local cuts that we are facing, whereas Barnet Council, I hold no candle for them, and they have made deeply irresponsible decisions that have added to the pain. But let's be clear where these cuts come from. They come from the government. And so at one level, the connection is that simple, that a Labour government will invest and a Labour government will make sure schools are properly resourced. And we've heard about the resource gap, so we know what that means. So that's kind of connection one. But I suppose also connection two is kind of getting, and it's back to some of these broader issues of the erosion of the system, getting parents more active in thinking about what they want their education system to look like and what it means for it to perform for their children. And so I think it's something which also hopefully spurs some parent activism. It will also be helpful. Yeah, sure.
We've only got a little bit of time.
Yeah.
Can I talk about the education system being fractured, broken up, 27 different ways to become a teacher, so many different ways to become a free school, to become a multi-academy trust. We're talking structural issues, and where do you see the NES coming in as a way forward, as a transformer?
Well, I mean, I think we've talked about some of the ideas, and clearly we'll want to revisit, as others have talked about, the whole role of academies. I think Labour has a very clear policy on free schools, and so there's a whole range of ways. I suppose what I'm prompting folks to do is that absolutely all that's in there, but can we think even more broadly about how we use the NES, to fix, to help address those problems, but also to be more broadly one of the tools we use to help drive a reskilling and transformation of the economy. But I think that's absolutely
so
what.
Let me be really, really specific.
Yeah.
Are we talking about Saracens being left in place to provide education in Barnet?
Well, so and so I think policy is still kind of being worked up, and I'm not going to talk about specific schools, but look. Okay,
not forget about specific schools. Forget about Barnet. Let's go back to the NES. Let's go back to the way that academies are helpful, or
so. Look, I mean, when I was a school governor, which I was for many years, I was, we resisted the setting up of an academy, right? So look, well, to an extent, Labour's still developing its kind of policy. My view is MATs broadly don't work, right? They get rid of democratic accountability. They don't perform, as we've heard, and it's even on the metrics the government sets. So I personally would want to look at what we do kind of with them, and I wouldn't and the path the government's taken, which is whenever school fails an Ofsted or anything, it's transformed forcibly into an academy. That needs to stop and be reversed. But my general view is that we should be moving away from academisation, right? Clearly. But the technical things, I don't want to talk about specific schools, and that's does that make sense?
Yes, I think I'm really asking about contributions from you because you're standing as obviously as our candidate when you get in, but also now we are formulating, aren't we? Before a general election is called, we're formulating what length of time it might take to deconstruct what has happened in the market, including, for instance, in our borough. Really, we're looking at the multi-academy trusts that exist coming into taking over the schools that are standalone academies. What do we feel as campaigners in Barnet we can do to call in what is the alternative, what sorts of things we would be wanting to see an NES promoting?
Well, isn't that what this meeting's for, to throw
Yes.
open and kind of
Yeah,
raise some of these
absolutely.
ideas?
So I'm asking you to come forward but you don't have to. I mean, I feel your reticence.
David,
So
I think Jenny's on about the big business aspect of this.
Yeah. Well, sorry, but
Yeah, in school cuts terms, thanks, Kelly, that gives me a really nice way of putting it. So if you are in, let's say, a Summerside trust, if you're part of the, what used to be Summerside is now Reach 2. Reach 2 is a very big academy trust. And these multi-academy trusts, you first top slice and give that company 6% of your budget.
And as I've
That's
said,
one.
I'm really sceptical about
It could
MATs,
go right up to 10%.
right?
Of the budget.
And the fact that you have CEOs being paid hundreds of thousands of pounds, right? To me, just isn't right, and they're not delivering results. I've kind of said that, and again, I'm quite sceptical about the role of big companies involved in setting up schools. In general, not comfortable with it. But I don't want to talk about every case and case by case, because I don't want to obviously preempt the broader conversation.
I think David's right in saying that Labour Party policy is still in flux. And really, I think the point of this meeting, or at least why I'm here, is to try to influence people to actually, I think it's really important that we demand wholesale nationalisation of all schools. And I think actually I would hope that a future Labour government would take some of the kind of the essence of what we argued for after World War II, which is actually proper comprehensive education, and then now upgrade that and take that forward. And I think as part of that comprehensive education, we need schools which are actually integrated with each other properly, and that means therefore I don't think, personally speaking, there is any room for free schools, any room for academisation. I think pardon? And all of that, I think we need actually truly comprehensive system. I think, I work in a comprehensive school. It's been kind of, I think the kind of label is bog standard comprehensive school, and I hate that. So I think actually, if you think about it quite deeply, what comprehensive education has at its essence is that idea, and then I think Jeremy argues for it really well on Saturday, is the idea actually education is for everyone, higher quality education is for everyone. And if I may say, actually, it may, I would say, involve transforming our notion of what education is as well at the moment, which is, I think, we need to actually, I think, if not weaken, cut the link between education and the marketplace. I think you become educated because, and then I'm quoting Marx now, just as in the ideal society in the future, you hunt in the morning, you fish in the evening, you rear cattle in the afternoon, and then in the evening you can criticise over dinner. I think actually whether you're a road sweeper, whether you're a lawyer, whether you're a teacher, whatever you are, we all have a capacity to learn ever more. And I think actually with the national education system, I think David's quite right. We do need to move beyond the kind of stale debate. I think we end that by saying we just need to nationalise all academies, all free schools, but then move beyond that by saying actually what is the purpose of education, what's the scope of education, how can libraries, how can youth centres be integrated. And I hope I think there's the NPF forum, I think they're opening for feedback consultation soon. I hope we feed into that.
On the National Policy Forum, that's actually open non-stop. So they're rolling, taking any kind of submission from anyone.
Oh, bloody hell, no, it says Sunday, 30th of...
Oh, Sunday the 30th? Oh, sorry, for this year's conference, yeah. So you can submit at any time, and what the Labour Party does is every year it will provide an update, but obviously policy is formulated for a general election. So if you make a submission by the end of this month, then that can be included in what the National Policy Forum will present at conference. Sorry, Kevin, did you want to ask a question? It's Keith, sorry.
Okay. Well, I'm just going on some of the comments. It was mentioned Henrietta Barnet being a state school. Well, in fact, like most secondary schools in Barnet, it's no longer a state school. It's a state-funded independent school. You can go to Company's House and look up the details, some details. They don't give you all the really important details. And, you know, we've got this problem, and I was pleased to hear what Jumbo was saying, because before that I was hearing lots of wishy-washy stuff, and we actually do need to get a successful education service. It's got to go back to being local, and if we look at Finland, for example, where they don't have lots of different types of schools and competition, and at the moment the selection process is certain schools select the pupils they want. It's not a parental selection, although people are conned into believing that. And I'm finding it frustrating that we're not recognising that we need to have the end of academies, and saying the end of academisation, that's actually converting schools to academies. I was at a school today in Barnet which is looking at academisation, well, not looking, they left the unions out in the consultation and are proposing in January to become an academy. So it's still going on. And I'm hearing nothing for the National Education Service saying, right, we need local things, because when we've got a school in Barnet which is looking in a couple of years' time at £1 million deficit, and it's a standalone academy. It can't survive like that. And it's the only solution it's got is to join a MAT. And they're looking at different MATs. It's a school that doesn't want to do that. It's actually quite a good school for staff, where they like working, but it's not going to survive. And I need to hear something to reassure me that we are going to actually have something which gets back not just funding, but gets back the structure right, so that schools aren't competing and that they are local. When United Learning, took over Totteridge Academy, I was being told about all the benefits of being in a MAT. Oh, like teachers can go to neighbouring schools to train them. Well, neighbouring schools. Totteridge Academy, you've got Kew Girls up the road, you've got Mill Hill County. No, they're talking about in South London, in Walthamstow or somewhere. You know, they were the nearest ones. They're not the sort of place you'd go along for the afternoon. And we need to get back so that the local authority has also got the structure, not the mats spread across the country. Sorry, I'm getting really frustrated because I'm not hearing the meat on the bone for the NES. And for me, as a teacher in Barnet, seeing what's happening, I need to see that. Okay.
Just wanted to, I think Keith has expressed the frustration that many teachers and other NEU members feel. And I know from my work as London Regional Secretary that there are, local authority directors of education who equally feel frustrated. They are trying to maintain a proper local education service, but they still do not see something which is stopping the continual slide. Because if there isn't a clear policy that the next government will reverse this, not just stop further schools becoming an academy, but actually reverse, and if you want to use Jumbo's phrase, nationalise schools back into a genuine national education service, then schools will continue to go down, and it's happening all the time. The schools, because they do not see an alternative, therefore they're moving towards academisation, or of course then the individual academies are being swallowed up by the bigger change, which is the inevitability of the marketisation. I mean, I appreciate, and I think that's the point, that everybody here needs to contribute to the debate, that the debate is still going on. I mean, I just wanted to throw something else in, though, because if, of course, those of us who remember nationalisation, sorry, Jumbo, those ancient people on this table will remember even then there were debates about, well, how does nationalisation work? You know, it may be a nationalised company, but what say do we have in it? And so I do think a discussion needs to take place about, if you reverse academisation, if you bring all schools into a local framework, as it were, how would that be run? Who would it be accountable to? And I would want to throw in, because I do think there is, in fact, a model which we've long forgotten. I mentioned it at the very beginning. The first Labour candidates that were ever elected were to school boards. Now, it was thrown out in 1902. We're talking a long time ago. But I do think it's worth looking back at a bit of history. We still have the you know, around London, the old buildings. We say that was an old school board school. At that time, you know, and of course it exists in some other countries, and we need to have a bit of research. It's not perfect. And others, say in America, might say, well, actually, this doesn't work. You know, there are issues to look at about how it works. But you know, I do think it would be attractive not to say you're just bringing back and recreating the old education authorities that we had, but perhaps something that could look at saying, well, no, we're bringing in something where there is real democratic accountability, that we would have elections, you know, to a local school board. Who are the people that you want representing your community? The staff, you know, which different constituencies would elect someone to that board. I think that's a whole discussion which, again, could make a discussion around the education strategy quite exciting, thinking how that would work in practice. So I just wanted the opportunity to throw it into debate. But,
Sorry.
Actually, to build on the point, you mentioned Finland, which I've actually made some notes about, because it seems like it is the international example that everyone looks towards. Not only is there the potential for a national education service to reverse and end academisation and actually reverse it fully and end free schools and academies, but we also have to look at private schools as well. You mentioned Finland as a standard, and obviously the reason it is, for those who aren't aware, in the post-war period, what Finland did that the UK opted not to do was to abandon the 3 or 4 tiered system it had of fee-paying, selective, and then what it called local schools, and replace them with a common school. Now, today, Finland, the teaching profession is the most prized in that country. You have a system that is massively oversubscribed. I think the nationwide average, it's 10% of applicants are accepted, and it's 7% in Helsinki. So you compare those statistics with the ones we just heard about this country, where we're struggling to retain half our teachers for the first 5 years. You have a very, very different model. And if people are interested, there are a couple of different scholars you can go and look up who are the main advocates of Finland's model internationally. So you have Pasi Sahlberg, who is a Harvard educator, and you also have Leena Krokfors, who's the professor of teaching at Helsinki University. There were some articles covering Finland that I read up in preparation for this. It's interesting that their view of the British system is that teachers are somewhere between administrators and people who provide children with tests. And obviously that is in stark contrast to their system. It is very much worthwhile reading about how that ethos of education as a public good is then applied in practice. And I think it's important for us, when we talk about the policies that we create within the Labour Party, to know that other countries have done this. So when we want to formulate a plan, there are other examples. And when we want to make the case in this country to other people, there are other countries that we can point to, and we can point to successes that will be against the inevitable backlash that we will face when we talk about unifying a system in the NHS, because we know exactly how the Conservatives will represent that. It will be a destruction of choice. It will be a lowest common denominator. We know those are going to come in, but there are very convincing arguments with success that we can point to. So that's something for anyone who wants to put on that National Policy Forum submission before the end of the month. Let's get that in there. Let's get the numbers of people requesting these things up so that we are listened to on that. Yes, Neo.
So just a quick point, just going back a bit, Maryam said about the ethnic minorities and children from those backgrounds, especially refugee families, asylum seekers, whose parents English is a second language, if they speak any of it at all, so they struggle the most. And then to compound the lack of process in education for the child, you've got mental health issues, both amongst the parents, but also I think the children will have that knock-on effect. So that's something else to consider.
Maryam, I was really pleased that you mentioned certain kids, because my son, he has autism. So he's been through the whole education system in this country. He's now 17. And when he was in year 8, he went to Totteridge Academy. So yeah, I'm well aware of what that school's been through. So this is a child who came top of his class in science in year 8. When he went back after the holidays, he actually, in one day, he had a new science teacher, a new form tutor. The new form tutor was also the new French teacher. It swung his head, and for the next 2 years, his education and his learning went down, 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 down. He came out with the most crappiest GCSE grades going. So I do not think the GCSE system are fit for purpose in this country. And I especially don't think they're fit for purpose for kids like my son, who need that extra support to get them through on a daily basis in the school system. So any national education system, for me, it needs to pay attention to kids who have SEN, and realise that these kids, they need a lot of support to get them into school. I can tell you loads of horror stories of local parents battling the system to get their kids into a halfway decent school.
Just on that point, I completely agree. Yeah. So I think the point of education really needs to be discussed in terms of the National Education Service. And I think, Jumbo, you mentioned it earlier, what is the point of education? And I think education needs to be turned into a social good. We need to be caring for our children. And I think at the minute, the system's kind of making teachers produce workers. We're so focused on getting our students the exam results, not really thinking of them as students, but just churning out data, because we're essentially assessed on our data. And, if we don't get the results that we need to get, then, that affects our pay, that affects whether, we're going to have a job, exactly, whether we're going to be in the profession. And another thing on recruitment and retention, I think things like Ofsted and league tables, all things that are contributing towards the marketisation of education, these are things that are also increasing our workload, because that pressure on schools is then placed on pressure on teachers, and then we unfortunately place that pressure on students, and so that's really not making the life of students any easier. So any National Education Service really needs to look into the effects of Ofsted, in particular, the way that it is right now. League tables based on data at the minute. I'm not saying, there should be no league tables whatsoever, but it just shouldn't be judged, schools should not be judged solely on the data that they produce. Because unfortunately, then what happens is, we are not caring for our students, we're just churning out results, and that really needs to change.
I think that's a good point. And can I add one thing to that? And so, Simon, you talked about the Finland example. I actually don't, in line with party policy, I personally don't believe we should get rid of private schools. But what I think the Finland system does show, because one of the key components of Finland is the esteem and social status of teachers. And so the single biggest defining thing about Finland and also Singapore is that teaching is not considered, to the point just made, a widget producer, someone who just manages a classroom. It is the best graduates, society, it pays well. It's seen as, the place we want to attract the best people and treat teachers properly, which deals with quite a lot of the issues of attrition, deals with a lot of those other issues. And I think these things are kind of tied together. We have a system where we're not investing, we're not treating teachers properly, we're not rewarding them, we're grinding them down, they're leaving, and schools are treating them as though they're almost kind of replaceable units, rather than people who are shaping our next generation, who are leaders for that. And so I think we've got to look, in thinking about the NES, not just in terms of the education we provide, but the entire ecosystem of education and the way it also supports good educators, because they are the thing that makes a real difference in a strong education system.
Yeah, I just want to enlarge upon what Michelle said. I'm a school governor locally, and one of the hardest things that these financial cuts have had, is the fact that we've had to make redundancies, and we're going through that process at the moment. But first in line for the redundancies are the teachers' assistants. And the problem with this, and the most sort of galling aspect of this is the children with special educational needs, the SEND children, who are the ones who are most in need of the teachers' assistance. And so they're the ones that get hit hardest. And nobody seems to take this into account.
I mean, I think you're exactly right, and kind of, Michelle, I'm really sorry about the experience no, it's not all right. When I was a young teen, I volunteered in a school, and this was under the Tories. It's in fact one of the things that shaped my politics. And exactly to your point, I was 14, 15, and I was literally sent in. So it was one teacher, 40-ish kids, and as a 14-year-old, they had no one else. So literally, I would say, "Oh, go and work with this," but I mean, I knew nothing. Right, and I volunteered a day a week, half day a week, and it was, you're absolutely right, and that system just utterly failed children. And the thing that broke my heart was that you could tell with a 6-year-old or a 7-year-old they're not going to get a fair shake. And I fear that you're absolutely right, that the kind of cutting away not just of teachers, but the whole support structure, and centres various different elements, but also the structure of assistance, of extra people who do special teaching, of the whole framework. And what the government's trying to do is A, squeeze the whole machine, but then B, when they're put on pressure on teachers, saying, well, we're going to keep teacher numbers up, we'll just strip away everything else. It's like with the NHS. We'll keep some things up, but we'll quietly, behind the scenes, tear away everything else, and then hope that the system stays on the road. And I think you're right, and SEND is unfortunately one of the places where that's the first place that shows. And it's disgraceful, and it's letting so many of our children down.
Any last questions, and then we'll just do a bit just tying up on the NES specifically.
Not particularly to one member of the panel, but to whoever wants to take it. Thinking about the bigger picture and moving forward and picking up on fragmentation of the education system, fragmentation of funding, and certainly privatisation, which comes through academies and free schools. Because those companies have for free taken the land, the buildings, the computers, everything, and have it in their power. ARC is an example in this borough where you don't need teachers because ARC has its own curriculum. Okay, and they will, to start with, still be employing people, but they don't have to be qualified teachers. This is the rule. If you become a multi-academy trust, you don't have to employ qualified teachers. So I think if we start with looking at the fragmentation and then move through to training, move through to what we've called extracurricular, so homework clubs, breakfast clubs, parent involvement, and strip away the idea of parent choice ever being anything but a con. It never did actually give anybody as an individual parent choice. Then we need to go further and say, and it was a crazy idea, because this isn't about parent choosing a school. This is about the schools existing and involving the parents. We used to have things going on, for instance, in the time of the Inner London Education Authority. And as I've said recently to people, I wish we had filmed what went on. I wish we had filmed some of the training that went on for teachers. And I wish we knew how to amplify and emphasize that if you don't have that going on, you are in effect asking teachers to be not respected, as David has said. No, the opposite, replaced.
Yeah. I think you've just answered your own question in reality. But,
well, I'm just asking for points,
but
I'm looking for feedback.
No, but I wanted to pick up on the issue that you just raised about the Inner London Education Authority, because I think there are particular London aspects of it we should look at as well in terms of possible models, because you're right. What Finland shows is that if you have a system that A, values education, but also values teachers as highly skilled professionals that need regular training, as all workers do in whatever field, and compare that with what they quite rightly perhaps is their rather dismissive attitude to, I mean, the fact is, as Maryam will know, just to get out on a training course at some point during the year is becoming harder and harder, far from it as a regular thing. Yet we do have the model, we did have the model of the ILEA, obviously a time when there was greater funding, but also where if you organise over a citywide locality in that way, that actually you've got the scale to be able to really provide proper support, to have advisory teachers, to have actual inspection that's involved being supportive and giving you useful advice at the end of the day. All of those things which are long gone. It is, of course, the risk that one of the reasons why schools are still being swallowed up by maths is that because of the spending cuts to local authorities, then the MATs can say, well, we can provide you with the answer. Because unfortunately there is a reality that the schools say, well, what does the local authority offer to me anymore? They haven't got any central services, they haven't got any advisors. I might as well go to this MAT who's promising me these resources, this curriculum. Well, absolutely, and of course the curriculum is, well, you teach it, as you say, this way or no way at all, and if you don't fit in as a teacher or as a student to that way of doing things, then you're out the door. But we are...
I meant that they're dealing with their own people who are in their trust. They don't provide services.
No, absolutely, but they are... But it is... It can sound like an attraction to a school that feels that it needs some support. So I think we have to set up structures and to show that we've got structures which will be able, and the ILEA, the whole issues of a GLC, the things that after all Thatcher got rid of because they were also an alternative way of organising things. We've got to look back to that. And just very quickly, because the issue about London recruitment was raised. Again, we have got a specific London issue there. And actually, is it about pay? Is it about workload? The two things were raised. Well, actually, if you put those two things together, actually a starting London teacher is not earning the London living wage if you do it on an hourly rate. The two things go together. So, it's hardly surprising that people are not staying in the teaching profession in London if on the one hand they're not being paid what meets the London cost of living and the hours that they're having to work to do that as well. So, clearly, again, there's a particular London issue, which obviously in the discussion around the National Education Strategy, we always have that difficulty of Londoners and about not wanting to shout too much about our own interests, but, it does have to be raised that in all the statistics, London is particularly a problem area in terms of teacher recruitment and retention, and, that needs raising.
Just a point really, I guess, tonight's really, and understandably focused in on school education, which is, and for all the reasons we've discussed, is crucial, and there's lots of exciting things that the National Education Service can do in this space. But I guess just a plug for, I think, early childhood development is part of the policy as well, and there's a well-established evidence base that investing in that area of a child's life is crucial for addressing inequality. And then secondly, I think one benefit of it that hasn't been mentioned is in health. We all know that there's massive discrepancies, or disparities rather, in life expectancy from most and least deprived areas. But we also know that people are getting long-term conditions over 10 years earlier in their life if they're from a deprived area. And so actually education as one of the major determinants of health has like a major role to play in increasing the health of our society and in addressing inequality in that way. And I think you can, not only is that like a major benefit that we should sell, I think it's also, it points to ways in which we can tailor the policy to maximise those benefits for people that need it most. And for example, focusing in on, preparing people for good quality employment and good quality jobs, for finding jobs that are appropriate to their health needs if they have them already. All of these things are really important. I think I suppose it's just about how we vocalise that and how we get that across when we're talking about this policy, I think, is the sort of question that I have.
Matt, thank you. I think that's an excellent point, and I suppose that goes almost back to the point I was kind of raising. I would urge people to think broadly about this. So I think I agree with the point absolutely about teachers and all, and kind of some of the focus that the last comments just had. But I suppose I'd add the point about early years also. We haven't talked much about FE, about, we've talked, obviously there's higher education, but there's further education that so many people are dependent on. And, again, in their attempt to make the sums add up when they're slashing, schools have had an 8% cut, FE has had a kind of 40% plus cut. Right, and so the people who are most at risk of falling between the cracks, unsurprisingly for a Conservative government, have been those who have borne the brunt of the harshest cuts, right, with impact on social justice, on so many things. And so I think you're right, and we need to look at, Jenny, you raised fragmentation. I think you're right. I mean, the school I was very involved with, we were very focused on building a local community of schools with a connected with the local authority, because that's the way you get the best education system for all, with schools working together. And yes, absolutely, because they face funding squeeze, then that's an alternative to a MAT, where then they're almost being forced into a MAT because they're being told you've got to make cuts. The local authority can't provide the kind of air cover services, and the only way to make economies is to go into a big group, and you can't federate, so go into a MAT. So I think the conception is wrong, but I think this broader conception, so we must absolutely focus on schools, but in this broader conception of kind of from cradle all the way through, because that's what's going to give the real skills transformation, which gives both education as an end in itself, but also as a vehicle to real social justice.
I think it's important also to mention that Labour commitment to it being free at the point of use, as well as the further education budget being cut. Fees were introduced. I actually have a friend right now who's retraining from being a swimming teacher to train to be an electrician. So he goes to college whilst he works. Apparently adult, as defined as being over 24, participation in further education has dropped from 50% to 15% of the total number of people. I believe that's since 2010. And the OECD rankings, a league table, a national league table, the UK is bottom for adult skills training and workplace training. So there are, as Matt and David have pointed out, there can sometimes be too narrow a conception of what education is and where it takes place, be it primary and secondary school, and then higher education, which we haven't covered either, at the expense of further education or early years. I mean, the Sure Start budget, which is obviously a Labour legacy, has been cut by 50%. A third of the centres that were open in 2009 and now being closed. 7 here. And I think there was a news article within the last week about recognised health impact of Sure Start Centre closes, right? It was...
Yeah, it led to reduced hospital admissions among those who attended.
That's right. Any other questions? Anyone would like to make another point?
Can I just go, I don't need to say it, I feel I should say it. Because my daughter did attend Henrietta Barnet. Believe me, it was the toughest time. She hated 11 plus, right? And we had these conversations because she went through the experience. My first time, her first time. Her experience generally overall, she loved it in terms of she enjoyed the teachers, but on reflection, at least 1 or 2 girls every single year self-harmed, had psychological went to the doctors. It's a fact. And not that it doesn't happen at other schools, but I have a niece, for example, who goes to Ashmore. Is that in Barnet?
Yes, Barnet School.
Okay, now that's, I don't know if it's partly selective or overall comprehensive, but there you can get 90+% in the exams, tests, whatever, and you are, what is it, a bit of and beyond, whatever, is that what it is? You can get 90+% at somewhere like a grammar school like Henrietta Barnet, you don't stand out.
Funnily enough, like my own personal experience, my sister went to Henrietta Barnet and I went to QE Boys.
Yeah.
And I was there between 96 and 2003.
Yeah.
So whilst we don't have the 11 plus here, we do have this kind of free-for-all model, which I have to say I found to be an intensely stressful and horrible time in my life. And my mum feels quite bad about it when I say to her, it was horrible. She says I had no choice to do that because it was that or you go to a bad school. Yeah, and we had to do 2-3 exams for each school. I will say this, I mean, QE Boys is an example of, I think, the academy model, or where it originated from, because that is a school that cherry picks the best kids from the area. It has its own quirky ways of doing things, which it justifies as being the results it gets in those already very talented children it's poached from the local area, and it's also ruthless when it comes to the transition between GCSE, where it needs that 100% 5A star to C, or whatever it is equivalent now, into A level, where they're looking for being as high up the league table as possible. So 30 kids from every year would get cut out of 180. So, a load of my friends, but obviously the model there is the schools around will take those kids and pick up the slack. And what we're seeing now, where more and more schools are academies, there aren't schools to pick up the slack. Nobody wants those kids, and then they disappear. They fall through the cracks. But it is quite sad to think that that model, which was more of an exception than anything, is now really the norm in such a short space of time. Because obviously that hasn't happened from 2003 to now. That's happened from 2010, 2012 to now. Such a short space of time. And when we were talking also about the challenge of bringing all of these schools back into a more unified system, the way that they have been handed out has been done in an intentionally erratic way to make it more difficult. This is what the Tories do with every service. When they change it from this kind of more universal principle to a marketised model, they're slamming a wrecking ball into it, and they're making it twice as difficult for anyone who succeeds them to reverse or repair or move to some new and more progressive system. So that is an unfortunate and regrettable challenge we will face, but obviously we should face it.
I've just come back, yesterday came back from Unison Local Government Conference, where I was one of a number of delegates who were trying to get Unison to support and join in with the boycott of primary testing, high-stakes testing in primary schools, which the NEU is leading on, which I'm also a member of. But we didn't, for various bureaucratic reasons, we didn't get it discussed formally, but by raising it, but unfortunately getting it blocked, actually I think we've created enough pressure that Unison is going to look at this and actually take some notice and hopefully respond positively. It's going to come up at the Local Government Service Group Executive, which is the lead committee on local government. The issue of exam factories culture in schools, I mean, it's absolutely, it's unrelenting in our primary schools now, and it's the statutory test that Martin has described, but it's also we also have regular high stakes tests taking place in our schools, which are not even statutory, but which are kind of SAT style practice tests happening in my school, happen on a termly basis in every single year group. Now I work in year 1, and we're basically trying to impose exam conditions on 5 and 6 year olds in year 1 who want to, you know, who come to school thinking, you know, bless them, come to school thinking that education is a sort of active, participatory exercise. And so they're presented with a written test and they want to talk about it. And they want to put their hand up and give some ideas and ask questions and maybe talk to the person next to them and so on. And we're being told, no, you can't do this. You know, this is just, keep quiet, you know, put down what you think, you know, don't, if you're unsure about it, you're just going to have to stew, because that's, you know, so the stress we're putting children from that age under, I think, you know, it's, and that's happening in all year groups. So it is really, and so that teaching to the test culture is just there all the time, and that's, you know, that's what I mean. I don't know if we've mentioned the more than a score campaign, but you know, again, that's something that so there's backed by the NEU, it's supported by a number of education campaigns. Please, people, you know, look up more than a score, which is campaigning on these issues. I mean, even the issue about GCSEs. I mean, comparable countries with the UK don't bother with the examinations at age 16. You know, they think there's better ways to do education than sort of put 16-year-olds through a load of stressful exams. And by the way, tests in schools seem to be increasingly about being kind of difficult memory tests, where you have to just memorise loads and loads and loads of knowledge, rather than kind of encouraging you to use your intelligence. And I think that's certainly also the case in the kind of grammar tests you get at the end of primary school, which, you know, grammar should and could be taught as a useful tool to help you understand language better and use it better. But it's not being taught that way. It's being taught as it's just a series of things to memorise for the sake of it, just so that some children will do well and others do badly, and you can kind of create a hierarchy there. So you know, we've got all those problems. But actually, even if we're talking about education being for work, I mean, even the CBI thinks that GCSEs should be abolished. That they're not useful.
Rarely we would agree with that.
Well, yeah. So, you know, we do need to, and I think, I think that the whole system of SATs and league tables. The other thing, I mean, I agree with the points about bringing all schools into local authority control. Another thing about Unison Conference, Angela Rayner was speaking at a fringe meeting there and talked about the fact that a Labour government would not allow any new academies or free schools. That the only new schools would be community schools and cooperative schools. I'm not exactly sure what a cooperative school is. And I think that we would want to get more clarity on that, you know, let's just say community schools that are accountable to local authorities. I asked her specifically about, can we move the policy so that we bring all the existing academies and free schools back into accountable local authority control, to which the answer was, wait till September. So who knows? But you know, there are apparently legal. There are legal, technical issues about contracts and so on. She said something about how local authority control in Kent, I think because of the grammar school system there, means something different from local authority control in other places. But yeah, I mean, I think that the issue is to keep pressing on that.
Okay. I'm sorry, everyone. We are out of time tonight. Does everyone want to take 1 minute to sum up, say one last piece, or anyone?
Well, if I could just do 10 seconds.
Yeah, sure.
It's purely an advertising pitch, which is, I'm sorry, I'm going to be a broken record. If people could sign up, even for one session, it will make a huge difference. Yeah, you see, already noise is coming off. But if people were, just come and see me afterwards, or email me, or kind of email me at davidforhendon@gmail.com. It will make a really big difference. But look, thank you all for coming along and giving your time. I think it's been a really interesting meeting, and thank you, Simon, for organising it.
I'd just like to say thanks to everyone. We need to. The Labour Party belongs to us, so I think we just need to keep chipping away at it. I think my mantra is really everyone's a socialist, secretly a socialist at heart, but some are just a bit more confident than others. So actually, we just need to encourage them, give them that confidence at the top, that actually what we do want is a completely integrated national education system. What we do want is end to high-stakes testing. What we do want is an education ecosystem, to borrow David's phrase, which is integrated and which is fit for the 21st century. That being, it's education for the human soul, as it were.
Love it. Thank you.
I'm not even going to try to follow that. Just want to say thank you.
Well, a very last word. I mean, right at the end there, a whole great debates we could carry on with about not least admissions policy, which is another thing you'll have to grapple with in the NES about how that would look. But you know, just to say at the end, I mean, Jumbo says we're all socialists at heart. As I said, the problem is that there are people who definitely aren't. You know, we're all people who want education because we have a vision for the future about education being about a better, more rounded individual and better for society as a whole. Mr. Johnson and co do not, and that's fundamentally that. You know, we've got to remember that, but also remember that those ideas, our ideas, are the ones that are going to win. Definitely. Thank you very much.
I was going to say, is there an NEU rally on Saturday?
There is actually, yeah, I should have advertised it, yeah.
I'll do that.
Yeah, Jeremy's going to be speaking there, and it's Saturday, 22nd of June. This is wrong, it actually begins at 10:30, doesn't it? It's in the morning, and it's at Central Hall, Westminster. Loads of people are going to be there, and it'll be... pardon? Finishing... It doesn't say, but the campaign's the campaign's a long campaign, and we'll have to keep on fighting. So Saturday.
One final thing, I've put a lot of the resources in terms of websites and information onto the Eventbrite and the Facebook event page for this. So afterwards, if you want to go there and find that, that's all there for the school cuts and everything else as well.
Yeah.
No, it's okay.
Which you're doing this campaign, or in fact normal. So I'll come down and help. This is my summer holiday.
Oh, thank you. So challenging this campaign for doing it through day.
Of course. Okay, so that's out.
So,